Well, hello and welcome to dentReviews. Tonight I'm going to be doing a review of the Moondrop Aqua. This is one of my favorite IEMs, probably of all time. Just get it right out there and say it. Boom. Review's over. See you later. But in all seriousness, this is a very, very good IEM. I had the opportunity to hear it 2 Can Jams ago in Dallas. I was hanging out with Super Review and one of his friends, and his friend had a set of this Aqua. It's a set that comes from Japan. It doesn't sell in the United States. It's not available here. So I listened to it, and I was comparing it to some of the IEMs that I know and love, and I was pretty impressed with it, honestly. I thought it was a very clean, very neutral sound with a very nice treble detail and resolution, and I really wanted more time to hear it, but alas, we only had 2 days there at Can Jam. So came home and I really kind of was craving to hear it again. So I actually heard that his friend was going back to Japan to visit, and I felt kind of bad, but I said, hey, if it's there and it was possible, would you mind picking me up a pair? And he said, sure. So he's awesome guy, and he was in Japan. He picked me up a set, and he brought it back. It was actually really funny because it wasn't available even in Japan because it was so popular. It was sold out everywhere. And the first day he went to get it, they didn't have any, but he was able to actually stop by one last time before he came back, and they had a pair available, and he got it for me. So I'm very, very grateful. So thank you. You know who you are. You're awesome. And I've been listening to this ever since as my main daily driver, and it's just as good as I remember hearing it that first time. It's really excellent. So let's kind of go over the design of this thing, the durability, the design, the ergonomics, things like that. First and foremost, you can see it's kind of a typical Moondrop design. It's a semi-custom shell. When I say custom, I don't mean that they mold it to your ear, but it has that sort of custom type design where it's got the nice ear shape to it, very smooth curves. I love the translucent plastic, and hence the name probably. It has this nice blue dynamic driver shell in there. It's really, really nice. The nozzle is kind of a typical Moondrop nozzle for these type of earphones. It's got a resin that comes all the way up to the end of the nozzle, and it's got 3 vents for where the sound bores come out. And they all have grip to hold the ear tip by the shape. They don't really have any extra ridge on the end, which depending on the ear tips you use could be an issue, but if you have an ear tip that's properly sized, it doesn't seem to have any issue. I haven't had any come off in my ear or anything like that with this earphone. It does a really good job of holding on. It has the 2-pin connector that's common of a lot of the Moondrop earphones. It has this very nice blue Aqua triangular teardrop sort of shape here, which I really like. And I like the way they design these to kind of shimmer in the light. If you can see it there, I'm trying to get it to catch just enough to see. Whew, there you go. Boom. I like that. It's kind of a glossy, shiny appearance. So that's the earphone body. The cable is not this cable. I will get to that in a second. This is actually the cable that they come with. And I currently have this on my IO Audio Sogno, if that's how you say that. And this is a 2-pin connector, obviously. I like that it has red and black rings on the cable to serve as indicators for your ear. It's got a really nice cord lock, and it's got it's kind of like a very tightly woven fabric cover, so it doesn't feel super plush and soft, but it is a fabric cover over the cable. I like that it has a very small centerpiece, and it's just braided all the way down. It goes from the 2 braids on the top to the 3 or 4 braids on the bottom, and then it has this connector here, and this connector actually has a screw-on piece here, so you can unscrew this, remove it, and attach a balance connector if you want to, and 3.5 if you want to, so you have a little bit of flexibility there. So overall, it's a very nice cable. So why in the world did I switch it? Well, I'll be honest, I do like this cable. It's nice. I have no problem with it whatsoever. However, when I'm traveling and I carry my earphones in my regular everyday carry bag that I have, I like to be as small as possible, and I like to keep things in cases like this. They're very small cases, and this cable does fit, but as you can see, it definitely takes a little bit of effort to get in and out of that case. So I really prefer to take something like this, which this is actually the cable that came with the Zero Audio 2. And you can see how incredibly small the connectors are. It has an almost non-existent centerpiece, and it's a nice right angle connector, and it's translucent, which, as silly as it sounds, I think it makes a nice match of the appearance of the earphone. And when you wrap this thing up, just look at this cable. You can just cram that right in here, and look how small that is comparatively. It's just easy. Boom, you shut it, and you're good to go. So I like that. It's small, it's lightweight, It's very flexible, it's comfortable, and I like the way it looks. So I've been using this on most of my earphones whenever I daily drive them. I kind of put this cable on there, so it's one of my favorites. I don't like that it doesn't have a cord lock, but a common thing that I do in all my cables that don't have cord locks, this is super simple. Just take a piece of like a sticky note or something like that, cut it to, small diameter or width, wrap it around, not maybe more than 1.5, 2 times, because you don't want to go crazy, and then actually put a few wrappings of just regular tape, like tape you'd use. What do they call that? Transparent tape. Anyway, stick that on there, and it just makes this little ring. And when you slide that up, it does a really good job. If you can tell here, it does a really good job of holding together when you have them around your ears. So it acts as a nice cord lock. So that's kind of the design of the earphone. I think it's a very beautiful, honestly, it's a very, very nice looking earphone. I like the acrylic shell a lot. I don't know if that will age and yellow over time. I hope not. But even if it does, it doesn't hurt anything. It doesn't affect the sound. And speaking of the sound, is there anything else I want to talk about first? Let's see. Again, it isn't exclusive to Japan, and I was fortunate enough to have someone pick this up for me. But there are a few sites, such as e-earphone.com, that sell them online, but I had a really hard time getting them, A, because they were out of stock, and B, because the language barrier is very high. You can use Google Translate and do things like that to try to navigate the site the best you can, but it was still pretty difficult to try to figure out what I was doing. Was I buying it? Was I pre-ordering it? Was I this? Was I that? So that was a little bit difficult, but that is one option if you want to go to e-earphone.com. I looked on eBay and on different forums and whatnot. I didn't see any used copies at the time, so I was very fortunate, very grateful to Mark's friend for picking these up for me. But as of right now, I reached out to Moondrop and I believe maybe Shenzhen, I can't remember, 2 different sites to see if maybe they would become available. And as of right now, they're only available in Japan, so that's kind of a bummer. But if you have a chance to get these somehow, either through the web or you happen to be going to Japan or you know someone that could ship them from Japan, I would highly recommend taking that opportunity to do that. These are a very unique earphone. They're what I would consider a very neutral earphone. Let me go here to a graph and show you what I'm talking about here. So you see the response here is pretty smooth, and from the lowest sub bass to the highest treble, there's really no major dips or peaks. Now, before you say anything, I know that there's this peak here, but there's a caveat there, and we're going to get into that in a second. So basically, it's a very linear overall response. My dentReviews under there, I'm not sure how well you can see that, or is it actually hidden? It's hidden. There we go. Okay, so that's my dentReview target. So you can see it's not far off from something like the Harman, which the Harman takes it a little bit more extreme in the treble and the bass. So I prefer my dentReview target there, a little bit more laid back in that regard, a little bit more mid-presence and less V-shape. So it pretty closely adheres to my target, honestly. There's only maybe half a decibel deviation here and there in the bass, and maybe this peak here, which again we'll talk about in a second. But first, let's go and compare it to a couple of the other Moondrop options before we get into the sound discussion here. This is the Moondrop Kato. This is an earphone that I've used for a long time as my primary driver, way back when, and you can see it's pretty close. There's actually a pretty similar frequency response in the mids and the treble, and the biggest deviation would be in the low frequencies, specifically in the mid-bass region. So here, between like say 60 hertz and 300 hertz, there's a lot more presence there, maybe 2 to 3 decibels, and the shape is just a little bit different. So that's the Kato. And I would say the Kato's response does lend itself to a little bit more firmness, not even because of the shape of the bass, but just because of the dynamic driver they used. Now, the Aqua is a hybrid, so it has a dynamic driver for the bass, and it has balanced armatures for the rest of the response. The Kato is a single dynamic driver, but even then, I EQ'd them to sound the same and matched the frequency response between them and measured, and they look identical. And even then, the Kato has a little bit more of a firmness to the bass, very, very, very slight. And it might just be that the overall sound is all dynamic driver. I really don't know, but it doesn't seem to be specific to the shape of the bass. But anyhow, that is the Kato. And then you have something like the Chu 2, which is an inexpensive option, so you might think, how does that compare? Well, you have a very similar treble and mid area with a little bit different in the peak, but a lot of this is honestly probably down to insertion depth and what tips you use and things like that, because you can see it's very similar. The peak's similar, around 9K or so, and has relatively the same amount of amplitude in the area there. The biggest difference, again, like the Kato, is below 400 hertz. The bass is more elevated in a slightly more rounded off shape. And then you have the Moondrop S8, which is one of their older flagship models. And I'm not sure how much that shows up on the graph. Maybe that helps. But basically, that has a very similar overall response again. And I think what they tried to do at the time is they tried to increase the bass presence at around 80 to 100 hertz here the most, because I did find that that earphone was very good, but it did have a very balanced armature sound to it. The timbre, the textural quality, and the way the firmness of the earphone sounded had a very balanced armature quality to it. A lot of, I think, listeners will perceive that difference and maybe not know what it is, and some of the reviewers will say that balanced armatures aren't as firm bass, and I don't really know what the difference is and what causes it. I do believe that I do hear a difference between balanced armature and dynamic driver bass, and I think that's probably the biggest difference there with the S8, is that that extra bass there was trying to compensate for that lack of firmness that you get when you're using balanced armatures for the bass. But overall, it had a very similar response. Again, slight deviation in where the dips are, and there was a lot more upper treble on the S8, which I do remember that, kind of a high peak, which gave it a little bit of a nice airiness to it, but for me, it was a little bit too balanced armature. And then last but not least, the LAN, that I believe is a single dynamic driver as well, and that is a very inexpensive earphone, and that, again, measures pretty reasonable compared to the Aqua. Now, you'll see the bass is a little bit less than the very, very sub bass, but overall the frequency response is similar. Once again, the dips and peaks up here are slightly similar, slightly different, I guess you could say. But here's the thing. That is the stock measurement, but the way that it sounds when you shift that peak can drastically change. So let's say we go and we put it in what I call the mid. If you just put this on here, see, it actually lowers that peak down and makes it sound a little bit better and more full in the 7K area for me. But even that's not the best in my opinion. In my opinion, the best you're going to get in terms of response is you're going to get what I think sounds and measures the best is the foam. And if you look at that, there you go. So the foam is very, very smooth. It actually takes that treble response and it really dips that peak down there. This is my target here. So now you can see like just how incredibly smooth and close to my target is. Sure, way up high it might measure a little bit low, but as I've talked about in other videos, everything above 10K on a lot of these measurement rigs is kind of hit or miss. I wouldn't say I would gauge the accuracy of that completely, but you can see overall it just does a really good job, and that foam smooths that out perfectly for me. Now I do notice that if I push the foam in further and I wear them at what I would say deeply, then it kind of even subdues that even more, and then it can maybe it's smooth and relaxed and sounds great, but maybe the fine details become a little bit softer, whereas if I just wear them mid and like average in my ear with the foam tips, that's exactly the response I'm getting that's measured here. And before I go any further too, I just wanted to say, I know I talked about the fit and fitment and everything a little bit here, but these are very comfortable earphone, and I just want to show you, if I were to put this in my ear, what they look like, because that's kind of how I wear them with my foam tip. And if I were to push them in even further, you can see it's probably not a huge difference, but it's just a little bit deeper, and then obviously you could wear them a little bit more shallow like that, but I just kind of wear them kind of gently, just push them in. It makes a full seal, and it sounds great, and they're very comfortable. So that's just a quick show of the fitment there. So it's very smooth, very comfortable earphone. So yeah, the response is great. So how do they sound? Well, as you can see, the response is clean. It's smooth. There's no major dips or peaks when you have the right tip in your ear. I highly recommend tip rolling, as they call it, which would essentially be just trying different tips over and over until you find one that sounds good to you, fits good, gets good seal, removes any obvious frequency issues like peaks and things like that. And sometimes even if there's a peak, the peak can actually help, because what you'll find is in the frequency response there'll be a null or a dip and the peak followed by that. And sometimes if you can shift that peak down by wearing a certain ear tip at a certain depth, that peak will not only go away, but it will fill in that null and make it a lot more smooth and a lot more linear in terms of the response. So how do they sound? The Aqua is, again, I said at the beginning of the review, one of my favorite IEMs I think I've ever heard. It's not perfect. There's not a perfect earphone that I've heard yet, but it's very, very linear, very, very smooth, very, very resolving, and very, very just accurate in a very non-offensive way. If there was one single complaint I would say is that maybe I do wish that it was a dynamic driver earphone. If they could get the same exact response with nothing but dynamic drivers, I've always wanted to hear what that would sound like, because my opinion is that it would have a little bit better textural quality to it. The timbre of this is very balanced armature, which is not necessarily bad. Balanced armatures are considered fast drivers, so they have a good transient response and they have a lot of fine detail. So compared to dynamic drivers, they're often considered more high resolution, but I think that's kind of a little bit deceiving because honestly, not many dynamic drivers are tuned to the degree of these multi-driver earphones, such as the hybrids with dynamic and balanced armature, or balanced armature and EST or planar or whatever. So what you have is you have kind of an unfair comparison, because a lot of the dynamic drivers are single dynamic drivers and that's it. I haven't seen a lot of multi-dynamic driver only earphones, and I think if I had to guess, it's probably because of the size. Dynamic drivers are generally larger than balanced armature drivers, and to fit 4 or 5 of them in a shell would make a really large shell. That's just a guess. I don't know. Maybe there's more to it than that, but I'd love to hear one that has a similar frequency response that's only dynamic driver. Even with that said, I think the textural quality is very, very good. They're smooth, and because the response is so smooth, at first, some people might find that they're not very energetic or that they're kind of laid back. Well, first, if you use the right tip, you can fix that by adding a little bit more treble energy to it, and some people might like that. But I actually prefer this more smooth, refined sound, because as you get used to a very smooth and refined frequency response, you notice that you start to hear details between all of those frequencies that are masked in other earphones that might have similar frequency response, but maybe a bit more V-shape, or a peak here and there, or a dip here and there. Sometimes it can give a little bit more sense of energy, maybe of tight, firm bass, or maybe of high, crisp air, but it comes at the cost of that true totality of revealing details, because you might have instruments that are in a band or an orchestra, and depending on that frequency response, certain instruments are going to sound a little bit more farther back or subdued in the mix, whereas with a perfectly smooth and linear frequency response, even one that's tilted more warm or more bright, if the whole response is smooth and gradual, a lot of that masking is removed, eliminated, and you are able to hear the finer details of all those instruments the way they were mixed or recorded properly. And there's a debate as to how much bass and this and that and whatever, but in general, I would say the smoothness of the response is probably one of the primary factors that prevents masking of details. Now, to a degree, if you tilt it enough, you will get masking from the bass or the treble, but this is what I would consider right on that just perfect balance of tonality. The bass, the mids, and the treble are just phenomenal. Now, if you look back at the target one more time here, you can see that there's a little bit of maybe a peak, if you want to call it that, or a centering of the treble at around 3.5 kilohertz, 3 kilohertz maybe. And according to my target, there would be a little bit more here and maybe here to kind of round that off and make it a little bit more smooth. I call that the etymodic treble, because the etymodic treble is a little bit more maybe lower treble focused, which I think the etymodic diffuse field target, in my personal opinion, is probably the most realistic and believable target for the treble. Now, if you look here, this is the etymodic target. Now, it's actually not far off, but you'll see there is a little bit less at the 2K, which that's what really makes etymodic. They have a lot of that 2K energy, but I love that. And when you have the corrected, what I believe is corrected bass response on the etymodic target, you end up with basically a very similar treble to this. It's not far off, and it does a really good job of revealing details. It does a really good job of sounding unoffensive. Drums and instruments have enough tactility, enough snap to them, enough firmness and texture to them without sounding too aggressive. Again, with the right tips, if you can find the right tip that gives you a nice, good, smooth response. The bass is linear, and while I would say the bass might be on the lighter side for some people, the bass extension is excellent. If you have a song with a very deep sub bass, it does a perfect job of really hitting that low, deep bass impact. It's just not high amplitude, so it's not going to be bumping and really thumping in your face. Now, of course, you can EQ it and get a lot more of that if you want it, but I actually think this does a really good job of getting sub bass to be portrayed correctly when it needs to be, and then getting out of the way when it doesn't. So just to give you a couple song examples, for instance, I often talk about David Gates' Clouds and Rain Suite. That's an awesome epic song. It's like a 3-part, it's like a sonata, I guess you'd say. It's very awesome. It starts with a piano and orchestra, then goes into some vocals and drum parts, goes back to a very quick piano interlude thing, and then goes back to the final section where it's a lot of drums and bass and guitars and vocals and things like that. So a full like orchestral band, if you will. In that song, this does an excellent job of bringing out all the orchestra and all the nuances while allowing the orchestra to sound relaxed and lush. There are other earphones like the Etymotic even, without any EQ. The Etymotic does a really good job of portraying a smooth, liquid, orchestral quality, but it kind of comes off as more in your face. This has a little bit more of a laid back quality to it, which I like. I appreciate a lot for that type of music because it allows you to listen to it very easily without having to, turn the music down or have your ears pierced with certain instruments. It's just very easy to listen to, and by being easy to listen to, you can really focus on all the minute details, and I think it does a very good job with that. Those minute details are very present and very clean without being super crisp and super bright, so it's got a very good balance of being soft, warm, and relaxing while also being as bright as it needs to be, while revealing all the treble details with clarity and definition. I'd say sharpness, but again, I think sometimes sharpness can give you the mistaken idea that it's too bright, that it's got a peak or something. No, this is sharp in the sense that it's like a fine, highly sharpened knife, that it can cut through the details very, very cleanly and with finesse, rather than a knife that's got a serrated edge that you have a lot of sharp cutting ability, but you have to really aggressively cut. This is more of like a fine tooth or fine edged knife, in that it's smooth while also very fine in details. And I like that. So another example in terms of music would be if you listen to the song On the Run, I believe is the name of it, on the Pink Floyd Dark Side of the Moon, one of the first songs. And it has the guy and his heart's thumping and he's running and it's got all the sound effects and stuff, and that deep sub bass comes in and it sounds so good because the extension of this sub bass is so deep that at first it's just, all the ambient noise and everything, and then you really get that nice thub, 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 and it sounds great. So that's an awesome experience, and all the treble quality and the smoothness really lets you kind of sink yourself into that ambient environment. It just sounds really nice. Another song I always go to when I'm testing is Men I Trust, Break for Lovers. This is where I would say maybe I hear that dynamic driver bass is good, but not the pinnacle of bass that I've ever heard. I think something like the IO Sogno actually has a little bit more firmness and tactility in the bass that sounds more correct to my ears, whereas this bass sounds, frequency-wise, it sounds great. I have sub-bass and mid-bass presence where it needs to be, but it still sounds maybe ever so slightly soft in comparison. Now, I am using the foam tips, and I don't know if this is a placebo thing or whatnot, but I do believe that every time I've ever had an earphone with a foam tip, I feel like even if it measures with a good bass response, it loses something. There's some tactility that is maybe slightly lost. So I'd have to do more listening with the silicone tips, and maybe your mileage may vary, but maybe you'll have a little bit more firm bass with that. But with the tips that give me the best measured frequency response that matches my hearing in terms of how smooth and accurate the response is, the bass in that song, Break for Lovers, sounds maybe ever so slightly soft in its textural quality, but it hits with the appropriate amount of volume and amplitude, and there's no bloated mid-bass or anything like that. All the treble details are very clear, very spicy where they need to be, very defined. The stereo width is very nice. It has a lot of the like kind of separated and very high level of width. The soundstage, the sense that you get when you're listening to her vocal in that song is very good. The vocal kind of stands out in front of you nicely, carved in its own little space. It sounds very nice. I like that a lot. A lot of earphones can't really get that effect. Another example of that effect that I love is the song Goodbye by FM84 and Ollie Ride, I believe it is. Is it Ollie Ride on that one? I think it might be. But anyway, that vocal is so what I would call holographic. If you ever listen to that on a really good set of earphones that's very neutral, the vocal just sounds like it's in the ether in front of you, and it's awesome. And this isn't the most phenomenal version of that song I've ever heard, but it does do a really good job putting that vocal out in front of you and making it sound very, very clean and nice and airy. Whereas I don't think I've ever heard an earphone portrayed as well as a headphone. This definitely is up in the upper echelon of how well it gives you that effect. Another good thing is the Dire Straits song Money for Nothing. The intro electric guitar, when it dies down and the drums stop and it just goes to that banging guitar, it just sounds so good. You hear all the overtones and harmonics of the electric guitar with clarity and a nice start-stop kind of attack to it. and it has a very nice amp noise. And if you're familiar with that song on a nice set of speakers, this does a pretty good job of reproducing all of that quality, and I think it does just an overall good job of making it sound like an actual amplified guitar. And when they mic an amplifier, when they record an electric guitar like that, it sounds like that. If you've ever been in a room with a guitar like that, it's awesome. So those are kind of the sound impressions. I think that in terms of the earphones that I've heard, while it may not be a perfect frequency response, although it's very, very, very good, it does an exceptional job at being resolving and detailed and smooth with just the slightest bit of a relaxing quality to it. Something that it reminds me of in that quality of being relaxing while also being refined is the Dunu EST112. But that had a little bit more mid-bass and a little bit more recessed lower treble, but it had a nice resolution and clarity to it that I always found that despite the response, I always liked the way it sounded. It was a very relaxing, easy listen. This is similar in that quality, but even more refined and more neutral, in my opinion. But it does just give it an easy listening. And for a lot of music, that takes off the edge and allows you to just lay back and enjoy all the details and the fullness of the song and the lushness. And it still has enough of the treble accuracy to give you the clarity and the presence of treble that certain songs demand. And again, if your recordings aren't phenomenal, you might hear that these might reveal the flaws in your recordings more than some earphones, but I still think it does it in a way that's unobjectionable and enjoyable. So that's kind of overview of the sound response. I think this is an excellent earphone. I think it does a very good job at everything. There's really nothing that is lacking. It's got a good cable, good design, good fit, good comfort, excellent sound. It's even a reasonable price at around $350. The biggest factor and the biggest frustration is that it's only an exclusive to Japan. So I would say that from my personal taste and how much I like this earphone, I'm very glad I was able to get a copy. If you can't get a copy, there is one alternative, and let me go over to Super Review's site here because he has another earphone model. All right, here it is. So let's take a look at this. So this is the Moondrop Blessing 3 Aqua and the Moondrop Clinical Dusk. So you can see that overall there's a very similar bass response, and other than that, the real difference comes down to this lower treble. Now, there is the peak here, but you remember in my graph with the foam tips for me, that peak was diminished significantly. So I'd actually say that most of this upper treble measures pretty similar with the right tips, but you're always going to have this extra lower treble here that the dusk is a little bit more subdued. Now, that gives it a smoother, more laid-back sound, which I already said that I thought the Aqua was a little bit smooth and laid back in some degrees, but this lower treble, I would say, is kind of that sort of edemotic quality, that part of the edemotic response that I think is really nice. The Aqua is a little bit closer to that. It's not perfectly there, but it's got that lower treble tilt, which I like, whereas the Dusk, I found when I listened to it a few times in the quick side-by-side comparison at the hotel, I found that it was a little bit more laid back, and it sounded great. It was very smooth, very high resolution, very clean, nice sounding earphone, but I did notice that the Aqua just had a little bit more of that firm, tactile treble quality that I liked. So if the Aqua's not available, I think that is obviously an excellent alternative. It's probably similar price, it's available in the United States, similar design. It's just a very, very close second, but I do think the Aqua, in my personal opinion, just has a better sound to it. There's something about the overall presentation of the sound, the firmness of the treble, the tactile quality, and just the general sound that I think is better. So that's one alternative. Another alternative that is not exactly the same, but I do think has a very similar sort of neutrality would be the IO Sogno, but the difference you're going to hear is that the Sogno has a more smoothed off and maybe more liquidy sounding treble, whereas the Aqua has a little bit more of that treble energy and clarity, which relatively speaking they're not that far off, but the Sogno might be a little bit more scooped out in the mid-bass, upper mids, but it gives it a nice firm bass attack. And I mentioned that one because it's a similar price. I think it's $300 to $400. The other one that I would say is probably similar to this, and it's all dynamic driver actually, is the ARP Gear Hain, I think is how you say it. And with the right EQ switches, let's actually go pull that one up here. So this is the Aqua here, and if we pull up the Hain, you can see immediately there's a lot of bass there. You might say that doesn't look right, but if you take the actual switches and you configure them to be, I think up, yeah, that one there, boom, look at that. So just changing those switches has made that earphone a lot more similar to the Aqua. It's not perfect. The bass is a little bit different. In fact, I honestly think the bass on the Hane sounds better personally, even though the response is not exactly the shape of the Aqua, which is that more sub-bass tilt. The Hane maybe it's just all dynamic driver has a difference there, but it just gives it a little bit more firmness, which I like. And then the treble is very similar, but unfortunately, I hear this slight peak up here, and I have not been able to completely eliminate it with tips, but I have got it pretty subdued. So I don't find the Hane to be peaky at all, but it's a little bit north of neutral. So there is a little bit extra treble clarity in this area where the peaks are. I would say for me, if I had to guess, maybe another decibel or two lower than what's graphed here. So they exist, but they're not objectionable. In fact, to be honest, I think the Hane is one of the better sounding earphones, and I think it retails for less than $200. So you get an earphone for less than $200 that has bass and treble adjustment by just switching sliders on the side. So that's pretty nice. That's a very good alternative. However, in the entire scheme of things, I think the Aqua just sounds better. It sounds a little bit more refined, more high definition, just like a better quality earphone. I don't know if it's the drivers they use, the tuning, or everything. But anyway, those are a couple alternatives and a couple comparisons. For my money, I would take the Aqua. And is it worth going out of your way to get it? I don't know. I mean, I'm glad I got it, and if you have a chance to get it and you have someone over there, or you can find it online and navigate all that, Japanese translation kind of stuff, I think it might be worth your while if you know the kind of sound signature you're looking for matches this, if you're familiar with my impressions on earphones and it might kind of be pointing you towards that earphone, then I think it's worth a shot. I think it's a really good earphone. So I'm going to leave it there. That's the Moondrop Aqua. It's definitely in my top tier, way up there. I mean, really, really high on my list. Probably within the top 3 earphones in my tier list, if you want to call it that. So I'll leave it there. If you guys have any questions, let me know. I'd love to answer them in the comments below. And please like and subscribe if you don't. A lot of cats die of eye problems, and you don't want that. They just end up in landfills, and that's horrible. So like and subscribe to prevent that, and catch you guys next time.